Okay, so I've been told I have bad opinions about pretty much everything: music, movies, games, and honestly, that might be true. But I don't think most things are as bad as people say they are. I think they're just easier to dismiss than they are to understand. So I want to try something. I'm going to take things people hate, whether it be albums, movies, games, or just stuff people call trash or mid, or things that people claim aren't worth talking about, and I'm going to try to defend them. Not as a joke, not ironically, but to actually take them seriously. Because I think there's a difference between something being bad and something just not being quite what you wanted it to be. For the first episode of the series, I figured we should start with something really bad. Like, even the creator doesn't defend it bad. So, let's talk about Generation Swine by Mötley Crüe. Generation Swine is one of those albums that people don't just dislike. They write it off completely. It's messy, it's inconsistent, and it doesn't sound like the band people wanted it to sound like. And depending on who you ask, it's where things really started to fall apart for the Crüe. And I get that, I really do. Because if you go into this album expecting Mötley Crüe to sound like they used to, this album is going to feel wrong, almost immediately. The tone's different, the energy's different, even the way the songs are put together feels a little bit off. But I don't think that automatically makes it bad. The more I listen to it, the more it feels like something else entirely. Like a band trying to move past the version of themselves that made them famous without really having a solid plan as to what comes next. But that does lead to something I don't think people really give this album credit for. Because for as messy as it is, this might actually be one of the most emotionally different and honestly one of the most intriguing albums in Mötley Crüe's entire discography. To really talk about Generation Swine, I think you have to talk about how we even got here in the first place. An album like this doesn't just come out of the middle of nowhere. It comes out of a band already in the middle of an identity crisis. Vince Neil was gone, John Corabi had come in, and that version of Mötley Crüe had already pushed the band into a heavier, darker direction that a lot of fans never truly fully appreciated until decades later. And while that next record was already taking shape, that version of the band started to collapse too. Corabi was involved in the early material, the sessions got messy, pressure started building for Vince to come back from Elektra Records. And eventually that's exactly what happened. So by the time Generation Swine actually comes together, it's not really the product of one clear version of the Crüe at all. It's the sound of one band ending, another one trying to come back, and neither of them fully fitting the moment that they're in. And I think that particular tension is all over the album. Because this isn't a clean reinvention, it's not the sound of a band confidently stepping into a new era. It's the sound of a band trying to move forward while still bringing pieces of its old identity behind it. And as messy as that can be, I also think that's what makes it interesting. Generation Swine doesn't sound like a band that knows exactly what it wants to be. I think the best way to approach Generation Swine is not as some lost classic and not as a misunderstood masterpiece either. But it's a really strange, really uneven, and honestly pretty fascinating snapshot of a band trying to become something else before they fully knew what that something else even was. And you can hear that almost immediately in the album itself. Because the first thing that jumps out about Generation Swine to me isn't that it's bad, it's that it feels off, darker, more anxious, more self-conscious, like the band is reaching for something moodier and more experimental than people were ever really going to let the band who wrote Girls, Girls, Girls or Same Old Situation be. So the best way to tackle this, in my opinion, is to go track by track and break down what I do and don't like about each one.
Destroy. I gotta find myself some love. I gotta find myself some drugs. I gotta find some liquid sunshine. I gotta find myself.
Starting with the aptly named Find Myself. Generation Swine more or less tells you immediately that anybody expecting a return to Dr. Feelgood style chaos is about to be disappointed. Because for an album whose big selling point was the original vocalist Vince Neil coming back, the very first voice you hear on the album is bassist Nikki Sixx, and that's kind of perfect. It's funny in hindsight, but it also says a lot. Right away, the album is signaling that this is not some triumphant return to form, it's something stranger, more uncertain, and a lot more interested in figuring itself out than pretending nothing changed. And honestly, I've always had a real soft spot for Find Myself, because beyond just being a clever way to open the record, I think it's a genuinely strong song. It's moody, it's reflective, and it has this kind of uneasy atmosphere that feels really different from this version of Mötley Crüe most people have in their heads. It's not Kickstart My Heart. It isn't Dr. Feelgood. It's not a song trying to tell you who Mötley Crüe is. And when Nicky comes in singing about trying to find himself, it's not subtle, but I don't really think it needs to be. If anything, that bluntness sort of works in the song's favor. The album is telling you right out of the gate, this isn't going to be about confidence, it's going to be about soul searching. And the more I think about it, the more even the album cover starts to make sense through that lens. You've got the band wearing masks on the cover of a record that opens with a song called Find Myself. That can't just be an accident. Whether they meant to make it this explicit or not, that imagery lines up perfectly with what the album actually feels like. A band hiding behind an image, trying on different faces, trying to figure out what version of themselves still fits. And that's what makes this opener work so well for me. It doesn't feel like Mötley trying to fake being the old Mötley. It feels like they are being more honest than people were ready for. And if you came into Generation Swine wanting a big, loud, trashy reintroduction, I can totally understand why Find Myself would feel like a weird first impression. However, if you listen to it as the album's mission statement, it's perfect. And it's not the band kicking the door open, it's a band standing in a doorway, and they're not totally sure what version of themselves needs to walk through it, whether it's the glam and excess of the 80s or the more stripped down, John Corabi-led version of the 90s. Afraid, though, is where that uncertainty turns into something genuinely exciting. Because for me, this is probably the best song on the entire album. It's the moment where the experimentation doesn't feel awkward and starts feeling fully realized. The band tries something new here, really commits to it, and absolutely smashes it. The sound is darker, heavier, it's more controlled, and way more modern than what people probably wanted from them at the time. But I think that's why it works. It doesn't feel like they're forcing themselves into a trend. It feels like they've actually found a lane on this record that fits them. And more than anything, I think this might be the song, in my opinion, that in all of Mötley Crüe's discography, Vince Neil's voice feels the most natural to me. And it's not because he sounds like classic Vince, but because the song actually kind of meets him where he's at. It's not asking him to recreate the 80s, it is asking him to sell a cartoonish swagger. It lets him sound rougher, moodier, a little bit more uneasy. And that makes the performance feel way more believable. And I think that's part of why Afraid is so important to this album as a whole. Because if the problem with Generation Swine was just that the experimentation didn't work, that would be one thing. But Afraid sort of blows this argument up. The song works, it's focused, it's catchy, it's atmospheric, and it proves the band actually could pull this sound off. It feels as if the real issue is that a lot of people probably never wanted them to have this sound. And again, they wanted to go back more to the 80s. However, like all things, you do have the good with the bad. This brings us to track 3, Flush. which is probably one of the better examples of why I found this album so interesting, even when it doesn't fully work. Because musically, I'll be honest, this is a bit of a low point for me. It doesn't hit the same way Afraid does. It doesn't feel nearly as locked in. But at the same time, I really love the lyrical direction here. I love how sincere it feels. Because for all of the reputation, for all of the excess and swagger and cartoonish self-destruction people usually associate them with, Blush feels weirdly direct about what all of that actually does to a person. There's something uglier and more human underneath it. It's less about the image of burned out and more about the feeling of being hollowed out by it. And that's what keeps me from writing off the song completely. Even while the music doesn't fully get there for me, I still think the emotional core of it's very real. It sounds like a band trying to say something more honest than people usually give them credit for. And even if the delivery doesn't quite land as hard as it could, that kind of sums up a lot of Generation Swine for me. It's not always successful, but it is striving to reach for something more personal. And me personally, I'll take an interesting failure over an empty retread pretty much every time. Next, we have Generation Swine, the title track. Which for me is probably the real breaking point. Because while I've been defending the record pretty hard so far, this is the song where I kind of lose interest. I honestly think this might be the worst song in Mötley Crüe's entire discography, and that's frustrating. Because the idea behind it isn't even bad. On paper, it's them doing their own warped, sneering kind of take on something closer to the Sex Pistols. And that actually could have worked. There's a version of this that makes sense for the album. Something ugly, confrontational, and chaotic in a way that plays into the record's identity crisis. But the problem is the lyrics aren't just neatly sharp or refined. As the songs we've already talked about, I mean, Refine Myself feels direct and honest, and Afraid feels focused and fully realized. Generation Swine just feels sloppy. It's reaching for attitude more than insight. And I think that would be fine if the attitude actually landed. But for me, it mostly just comes off as forced, and I think that's an important distinction with this album in general. Sometimes Generation Swine is a mess, but it's a mess in a way that feels revealing. This is one of the few times where it's just messy in a way that almost feels undercooked. This would next bring us to Confessions, which I think is probably the most middle-of-the-road song on the album. It's not bad, it's not embarrassing, it's not some total collapse of the record's ideas. It's just a little dull. And especially coming after a stretch of songs that at least feel like they're reaching for something, Confessions lands in this weird space where it's perfectly listenable. It's just not memorable. It doesn't offend me, but it doesn't really grab me either. And I think that's maybe why it stands out less than some of the album's bigger swings. Because even when Generation Swine misses, I usually find the misses at least interesting. Confessions is one of the very few moments where it just feels a little safe by comparison. Admittedly, though, I do prefer the version floating around on the internet with Tommy Lee on vocals. There's something about that take that feels a little bit more natural, a little bit more alive, and maybe even a little bit more vulnerable. It gives the song a personality that I don't totally get from the album version. And with a record like this, personality really does go a long way. Next, it brings us to Beauty, which is probably the second favorite song on the entire record for me. I'm a really big fan of this one, because where some of the album's darker turns can feel awkward or undercooked, Beauty absolutely nails it. Nikki on lead vocals works way better here than most people might expect. And I think part of that is because the song doesn't ask him to do anything outside of its mood. It leans all the way into that darker tone, and both the performance and the music feel way more natural because of it. There's something cold and uneasy about Beauty, but it never loses its sense of control, and that's what makes it work so well for me. It doesn't feel like the band chasing a trend, kind of like I said before. It feels like them living in a mood that they actually know how to live in. And I think the more I think about it, the more this song feels like an early precursor to Nicki Sixx's later 58 project, which I've talked about before as well. And it's a project I absolutely adore. You can kind of hear the same impulse here, where it's more dark, more introspective and atmospheric. And for me, that makes Beauty one of the clearest examples of why this album is still worth talking about. Because when Generation Swine gets this side of itself right, it's not just interesting, it's genuinely great. And then there's Glitter. Glitter might actually have some of the best production on the whole album. It sounds great, there's texture, atmosphere, and a real sense of mood to it. But the song itself lands a little bit safer for me. It's not bad at all, it just doesn't hit as hard as some of the album's stronger cuts. If anything, it's a good example of Generation Swine sounding compelling, even when the songwriting doesn't fully rise to the same level. We follow that up with Anybody Out There, which is another swing that I just don't think really connects. On paper, them messing around with thrash metal is at least kind of interesting, if only for the novelty of it. And to be fair, Mick absolutely shreds on this song. That part works. But outside of that, I don't think it brings much to the table. The experiment is more interesting than the result. And for me, it ends up being the second worst song on the album. It's not completely without value, but it feels more like a band trying something because they can, rather than because they found a version of it that actually says anything. However, after that, Let Us Pray. It pulls things back into territory that I actually like quite a bit. It leans back into that darker tone, and Vince even gets to show off a harsher edge with some screaming that honestly works better than people might expect. There's a little more menace to it, a little more bite, and after a couple of tracks that don't really do much, it sort of goes a long way. This is also about the point in the album where I can't help but start wondering what some of this would have sounded like if Karabi had stayed on vocals for the album. Not because Vince is bad here, because he's not, but because songs like Let Us Pray feel like they're brushing up against a heavier, darker version of the band that Karabi would probably have slid into pretty naturally. And I think that's part of what makes this album so interesting in general. Even when it works, you can still kind of hear the ghost of the version that came before it. After that, we have Rocket Ship, which is another track that I'm a really big fan of. And I'll admit, I do have a little bit of bias here because I used to sing the song to a girl I dated. So it's always going to hit me a little harder. But even outside of that, I still think it's a beautiful song. It's maybe a little bit more distorted than I personally like, and I do think that muddies it up just a little bit. But the heart of the song still comes through, and that's what matters to me. Nicki takes up the microphone again and does a really good job on this really short track. There's something fragile about it, something sweet, and it feels like another example of this album tapping into a side of the band that people were probably never going to give enough credit for. For me, this is still a very wild swing, but it does hit. Next up is A Rat Like Me, which feels like this weird collision between Brutal Planet era Alice Cooper and the version of Mötley Crüe people are a lot more familiar with. It's got that dirtier, more antagonistic edge to it, but it still gets rooted enough in the band's identity that it doesn't come off completely alien. Lyrically, it reads to me like it's probably about celebrity worship, or at least the kind of sickness that grows around image and attention. Even if I don't think the song ever makes that idea totally clear, and that kind of sums it up for me. It's not a horrible track by any means, but it doesn't fully lock in either. It lands somewhere around the middle of the pack on my ranking. It's interesting enough to keep me engaged, but not quite strong enough to really stand with the album's best moments. Speaking of best moments, Shout at the Devil 97. This is one of the weirder inclusions on the album, but also one that I have a lot of affection for. It's a reworking of the classic from the album of the same name, And weirdly enough, this is actually my preferred version of the song. Part of that is probably because this is basically the version they play live now. So it's the one that feels the most alive to me. But I also just think it gives the track more bite. It drags it out of the 80s and drops it into the decade this album actually came from. The original has all the attitude and theatricality you'd ever want, but this version feels meaner, heavier, and a little uglier in the way that really works for me. And it's one of the clearest moments of Generation Swine where the band looks back at its past without just trying to recreate it. And I think that makes it way more interesting than people give it credit for. Although this does feel like a song tailor-made for John Corabi to have a version of the song to have sung live. After that, we go to Brandon, which is the final song on the album. Tommy Lee takes up the vocals here, which on paper might sound like kind of a novelty, but honestly, I don't think he's a bad singer at all. He's never going to be mistaken for some incredible balladeer, and Brandon definitely isn't the greatest power ballad ever written. But I do think the heart comes through. And for a song like this, that matters more than perfection to me. There's something genuine about it, something earnest, and I think Tommy sells that pretty well. If anything, stuff that's come out in later years, like Tommy Land the Ride, only makes me more comfortable saying that. He can carry a song when the material fits him. And while Brandon is definitely one of the stranger ways for a Mötley Crüe album to end, I also think there's something kind of fitting about Generation Swine closing on a note like this. Not with the swagger or with the chaos that you'd sort of expect from the band, but with something a little bit softer and a little bit more human. And so with that, my friends, we come to an end. And I think really the best way to understand Generation Swine in the end is not as some forgotten masterpiece and not as this total disaster people sometimes make it out to be either. It's a transition album. It's an identity crisis on record. It's a band caught between the version of themselves that made them famous and a version they never fully got the chance to become. And because of that, it's messy, it's inconsistent. Sometimes it reaches for something genuinely darker, more emotional, and more interesting than people probably expect. And sometimes it completely falls on its face. But even with those failures, that tells you something about where they were, what they were chasing, and how badly they seemed to want out of their own image for a while. And I think that's my real takeaway from all of this. I'm not trying to convince you that this is secretly the best album in their catalog, because I don't think it is. I'm not even trying to convince you that all of it works. It doesn't. But I do think it's worth another shot. I think it's worth going back to with a different set of expectations and looking for what's actually there instead of what people wanted it to be. Because when you do that, I think you'll find an album that's stranger, more sincere, and a lot more interesting than its reputation gives it credit for. And with that, I think that's where I'll leave this. It's not a masterpiece in hiding, and it's not an album beyond criticism, but as a work that is far more interesting, sincere, and worthy of reconsideration than its reputation would imply. It may never rank among Mötley Crüe's most beloved records, but I do think it deserves more than dismal. And if this first episode proves anything, I hope it proves that there is value in returning to the things we've already written off. Not to pretend they're perfect, but to ask whether there was something there that we failed to see the first time. If that sounds like a conversation worth continuing, then I hope you'll be back for the next one.